Did you ever get blamed for something you didn't do, just because you were easy to blame?
While my parents and my brother were boarding their flight to an island with turquoise water and cocktails served in pineapples, I was standing in a silent kitchen that smelled faintly of old leftovers, staring at a fridge so empty it looked like it belonged to a stranger who had just moved out. They had gone through all the trouble of booking my brother's first-class ticket, packing him sunscreen and designer sandals, yet they couldn't even bother to leave a single bag of groceries behind for me. It wasn't a surprise, of course, because nothing about this was new. My brother has always been the golden child, the shining investment of their lives, while I was treated like the side project they never really wanted to fund. But this time the contrast hit me differently, because as I stood there in my quiet house, scrolling past their smiling airport selfies, I felt something click inside me, something sharp, something final. You see, favoritism is one thing when you're a kid and you still hold on to that ridiculous hope that maybe if you try hard enough, get better grades, wear the right clothes, smile at the right moments, they'll finally see you. But when you're grown, when you've been working your tail off for years just to scrape by while your brother is flown to paradise because he deserves a break, the game stops being sad and starts being humiliating. My brother, James, is 2 years younger than me, and he has this way of moving through life like the world owes him extra oxygen. My parents worship him for it. He's ambitious, my dad says, as if ambition is just another word for freeloading. He's going places, my mom insists, while he crashes on their couch between unpaid internships and road trips with his friends. Meanwhile, I've been paying my own bills since college, buying my own car, and fighting for every ounce of independence. And what do I get? A dismissive shrug and a reminder not to overshadow him, as if being competent is some sort of crime. The day they left, my mother called me quickly, almost like a courtesy call you give to a distant cousin you don't really know. She didn't ask if I needed anything, she didn't even sound guilty. She said, "We'll only be gone for a week, honey, and James really needed this break before he takes on the next big thing." The next big thing? That was how she described his unpaid stint at a friend's startup, where his biggest task is probably remembering the Wi-Fi password. I almost laughed, but I didn't. I just said, "Have fun," and hung up, because honestly, I'd already wasted too many years pointing out the obvious. That night, I opened a cheap bottle of wine I'd been saving for no reason and sat on the couch scrolling through their photos as they boarded the plane. My father was beaming like he'd just sent a Nobel Prize winner off to accept his medal, while my brother was holding up a boarding pass like it was a trophy. They looked so proud, so united, so oblivious to the fact that I even existed. And maybe that was when I stopped caring whether they did or not. There's something liberating about realizing you'll never win a rigged game. It's like suddenly you're free, because you finally stop playing. I started to think back on all the other times I'd been left behind. School plays where they showed up late because James had soccer practice. Birthdays where the cake had his favorite flavor but never mine. Holidays where my gifts were practical, like socks, while his were shiny gadgets and expensive sneakers. It had always been the same story, and I had always tried to swallow the bitterness and tell myself I was stronger for it. But staring at that empty fridge, sipping wine that tasted cheaper with every sip, I realized strength wasn't about enduring neglect, it was about refusing to participate in it anymore. By the time midnight rolled around, I wasn't even angry. Anger is hot and loud, and this was something colder, sharper. I found myself wandering through the house, looking at the family pictures on the wall, me, smiling stiffly next to my brother, who always looked effortlessly adored, and I felt this bizarre calm settle over me. If they could erase me from their lives so easily, maybe I could erase myself too. Not in the tragic sense, not in some melodramatic disappearing act, but in a way that left them with a gap so wide they couldn't ignore it. I went back to the fridge, pulled out the last bottle of water, and as I twisted off the cap I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the last time I let them decide who I am. They had chosen James as their prize, their golden ticket, their future. And that was fine. They could keep him. They could pour all their money, all their love, all their dreams into him. But me? I was done. I wasn't going to be the afterthought anymore, the spare wheel in the family car that nobody bothers to check until it's flat. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew it would be something permanent, something that left a mark. I wasn't going to scream or beg or demand attention. I was going to vanish, and I was going to do it in a way that made them finally look around and realize just how much they'd lost. Because sometimes the loudest revenge isn't the explosion, it's the silence that comes after. And as I drained that last bottle of water, staring at my reflection in the dark window, I whispered to myself the thought that had been forming all night. If they wanted me gone so badly, I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. And once I was gone, there would be no coming back. When the photos from the island started flooding the family chat, my mother in oversized sunglasses pressed into my father's shoulder like a woman in a travel commercial, my brother raising a glass, as if he had just conquered something other than a prepaid lounge. I felt that familiar mixture of nausea and comedy that comes when people are so loudly pleased with themselves that you could almost applaud, and I realized that if I didn't convert the humiliation into motion, I would sit still and let it calcify into another year of being the reliable background character in their happy little broadcast. So I opened my laptop, took a breath deep enough to hurt a little, and began a sequence of quiet, careful steps that felt like finally placing my hands on the steering wheel of a car I had been told I could sit in but never drive. I started with the practical things because practical things don't argue. I moved my savings from the bank I chose at 19 because it was close to campus to a credit union where nobody knew my parents' names. And while the transfer crawled across the screen with bureaucratic slowness, I made a list of every subscription, policy, and account where I existed as a convenient line item. Then one by one I cut the cords that tied me to the people who loved to claim me when it decorated their reputation and forgot me when it cost anything at all. I removed myself as their emergency contact with the dentist and the primary care clinic. I changed the forwarding address on my mail to a rented box across town where no one in my family had ever set foot. And I created a new email that did not include the nickname my father uses when he wants to sound affectionate and authoritative at the same time. In between forms and confirmations, I let myself remember the origin story of this ridiculous hierarchy, and because I promised myself to stay honest, I admit that there were years when I participated willingly, playing the role of competent sister who could drive carpool and cover bills and set the table while the golden boy rehearsed his charisma and perfected the art of arriving empty-handed. Yet somehow everyone swore he brought the magic. I remembered the birthday when my cake was a discounted sheet with my name misspelled while my brother unwrapped the latest device with a price tag that sounded like a used car, and I remembered my father's favorite line, "She understands, she's strong," delivered with that benevolent tone that makes you want to laugh and bite something at the same time. Since revenge that smells like desperation never ages well, I kept my humor dry and my moves simple, and I chose the kind of revenge that looks like housekeeping until the moment it lands. I owned the streaming account the entire family used and paid for every month because it was easier than splitting it, so I changed the password, toggled the security logouts, and watched the device list collapse like a row of dominoes. Then I paused, considered the ethics for a long minute, and hit confirm. Because if my brother could sip cocktails on a beach I wasn't invited to while binging on the shows I bought, the least I could do was hand him the gift of silence, and while I was tidying, I switched off the shared cloud album I created years ago to collect holidays and pets and backyard barbecue mishaps, which meant that as my mother tried to upload the next sunlit toast, she would meet a polite message explaining that the album no longer existed. And perhaps, if the universe felt particularly theatrical, she would ask herself why. Some of what I did was pettier than I would advertise in polite company, like canceling the auto refill on the special coffee pods my father insists he can't function without because they arrive on my account with my card. Although I left a single unopened box in their pantry because I am not cruel, merely instructional, and I placed a handwritten inventory of everything I had paid for in the last year inside the box lid, not to present a bill but to present a mirror, which is harder to ignore when it sits on your counter between the toaster and the guilt. The heavier moves took more nerve, and I surprised myself by having it. I called my manager and said words I had rehearsed for months in my head but never dared to assemble out loud, telling her that I would be resigning at the end of next week. Not because I had a scandalous new opportunity, but because I was tired of being available to everyone and belonging to no one. And to her credit, she did not try to talk me out of it. She only asked if I was okay, and I said yes in a voice that made us both believe it. Then I scanned my lease because the landlord had mentioned a quiet studio opening in another neighborhood, and I filled the application with a careful, steady hand, listing my references and promising nothing dramatic beyond reliable rent and quiet breathing. By the time the sun had shifted to that late afternoon gold that makes even neglected kitchens look forgiving, the chat pinged again with the boomerang of my brother pretending to fall backward into turquoise water. And I found myself smiling because the smallness of the video made the bigness of my day feel almost private and sacred, and I realized that humiliation, when metabolized properly, becomes fuel that doesn't sputter, so I drafted a short, cheerful message to the family thread. Nothing unkind. Nothing that could be screenshotted as proof of my alleged hostility, just a plain sentence saying that I would be offline and unreachable for a few days while I handled some personal tasks, which was true, and then I left the group entirely, letting the app display that tidy little notice that people pretend not to notice. And because every episode needs a little finale, I set a delivery for the next morning addressed to my parents' house with my name on the label and no return address. A simple envelope containing a single-page printout of the streaming invoice history, with one line highlighted and a note clipped to the corner that read, with all the sincerity I could muster, enjoy the quiet. Which was not the end of anything important, but was the end of one tiny, stupid thread that had kept us tangled longer. Then I shut the laptop, exhaled slowly, and looked at the mirror above the sink, already imagining the 4 words I would eventually leave on it, because the outline of my vanishing had started to sharpen, and tomorrow, if my hands didn't shake too much, I would begin to pack. The morning after I slipped out of the family chat and watched the last of the streaming devices tumble from my account like vacationers missing a bus they assumed would always wait, I woke before the alarm because the kind of resolve that finally decides to live in your spine rather than in your throat does not ask permission. And I brewed plain coffee that tasted honest if not glamorous while I opened the closet and began the sort of inventory that separates what you carry into your next life from what you leave behind as a reminder to the people who believed you would never dare to travel light. I started with the sentimental objects, not because I am immune to nostalgia, but because I know that nostalgia is the most persuasive con artist in the room, and I laid out the items that were actually mine, photographs I printed with my own money. The chipped mug from a bookstore job that kept me afloat in the period when everyone insisted my brother was about to become very important. The scarf my college roommate knit during a winter that felt like a dare, and I packed them in a small suitcase that closed with an easy, confident sigh, while the things that had once been given to me as substitutes for attention. A pair of earrings presented as an apology, a sweater bought in a rush on the way to my brother's awards night, a framed quote about family that always read like an inside joke I wasn't invited to understand, went into a separate box labeled in my head as Museum of Minimum Effort, which would remain on the top shelf for my parents to find when the time came to search for proof that they had tried. The practical tasks followed like soldiers that had been waiting for clear orders, and I moved through them with a steadiness that surprised me, forwarding the last strips of mail that still found their way to this address to the rented box with its bland number and its promise of anonymity. Photographing every document I might need twice, because the only thing worse than leaving is leaving without the paperwork, and drafting a message to my landlord that struck the ideal tone between cordial and decisive, requesting the studio that had quietly opened on the tree-lined street where no one knows my maiden name or my mother's favorite bakery order, then attaching pay stubs and references while reminding myself that freedom, like any real purchase, requires receipts. I spent a long hour on the phone with the phone company because bureaucracy is the final boss of any clean exit, and I detached my number from the family plan without theatrics or speeches, just a sequence of verifications. That ended with the kind of soft beep that sounds mundane until you understand that the world has shifted an inch in your favor. Because a plan without rhythm trips on its own shoelaces, I balanced the heavy with the sly, and I allowed myself a small, pointed choreography that would not wound anyone physically but would make them pause long enough to consider. I gathered the pile of small household items I had quietly bought over the years when it was easier to fix things than to debate value: light bulbs, hand towels, a kitchen scale, 3 corkscrews, because apparently I am always the person who arrives prepared. And I listed them on a neighborhood page for a Saturday stoop sale under my name alone, adding a note that all proceeds would be donated in my parents' names to a scholarship fund for girls in STEM at the local high school, which was both sincere and strategic because the receipt would be bright, printable, and impossible to ignore when it arrived in their mailbox with a short thank you from the school that praises families who believe in daughters. While I photographed the items on the table by the window, I laughed at myself for caring whether the hand towels looked friendly, and then I realized the laughter was not self-loathing, it was relief, the kind that comes when your small jokes start sounding like evidence that you are, in fact, awake. I kept my hands busy and my mind sharper by assembling a decoy that would function as both cushion and mirror, creating a new calendar populated with bland entries that suggested an unremarkable routine in a nearby town: Pilates, grocery run, library hours, entries designed not to trick anyone forever but to absorb the first wave of panic into irritation, because people who have dismissed you for years do not pivot from indifference to empathy overnight. And if their first discovery was that I had grown boring rather than dangerous, then perhaps the truth would land in stages, and perhaps those stages would sting in the right order. I drafted the out-of-office reply for my old email with the kind of careful neutrality that reads as both polite and impenetrable, a single sentence noting that this inbox was no longer monitored and providing a general contact for the company support line, which meant that the next time my mother attempted to forward a photo album or my father tried to CC me on a family announcement about lawn maintenance, the machine would greet them with a locked door rather than an argument. The last move of the day belonged to the mirror above the sink, because I have learned that revolutions, even personal ones, require ceremony. And while the glass fogged faintly from the kettle, I traced with my fingertip the 4 words I had been rehearsing without quite admitting it. Then I wiped them away before the letters could dry because the message would be written later in ink, not steam. Instead, I left something immediate and almost tender: a small roll of blue painter's tape on the ledge and a black marker resting beside it like tools for a simple household fix, so that when my parents returned and wandered through rooms expecting the usual quiet compliance, they would find themselves directed to a single surface where the future would be written in my handwriting. And, because every chapter deserves a closing chord, I scheduled one more delivery for the day after their flight home, a slim envelope addressed to both of them with a clean printed label containing the scholarship receipt and a single sentence typed in an unfussy font: "Thank you for investing in a girl who will not ask twice," which was less a taunt than a statement of terms, after which I shut the lid on the suitcase, silenced the phone, and stood in the doorway long enough to feel the house breathe without me, knowing that in the morning the packing would begin in earnest and the mirror would get its permanent message. But tonight, while their beach sunset turned the family thread into a brochure, I had earned the kind of sleep that arrives when the exit signs finally light up. The day the studio keys slid across the leasing agent's desk and landed in my palm with a soft scrape of metal on wood, I understood that sometimes freedom does not arrive with trumpets, but with the very ordinary sound of a lock learning your hand. So I carried my suitcase up a narrow flight of stairs that smelled faintly of laundry soap and old books, set it on the floor beside a window that faced a row of patient trees, and stood still long enough to feel the space acknowledge me as something other than a visitor, after which I did what I always do when nerves threaten to rise in my throat, which is to give the nerves a task, beginning with unpacking the things that would make this place breathe like a home rather than a witness. The chipped bookstore mug went on the windowsill, the scarf found the back of a chair, the photographs lined the inside of a drawer where they could be opened like a secret when I needed proof that I had lived through worse than disapproval. Dressed as love. I spent the afternoon moving in a rhythm that was part choreography and part oath, calling the utility companies with my new address, while balancing on the kitchen step stool to label the breaker box like a person who intends to stay. then walking to the corner store to buy a cheap lamp and a better coffee, both of which I carried back with a ridiculous sense of ceremony, because I have discovered that dignity is often built out of small objects purchased with your own money and plugged in without asking for permission. And when the sun dipped toward the roofs and the pavement let go of its heat, I opened my laptop and finalized the final steps of the exit plan with the kind of steady breath that used to belong to other people in movies. I confirmed the credit freeze I had placed on my files so that no one could attach my name to anything I did not choose. I closed the dusty emergency account that for years had been presented as family safety while being funded almost entirely by me, and I scheduled the last transfer out of the checking account that still wore the same routing numbers I memorized as a broke student. A transfer timed for the night before my parents' flight home so that any automated drafts that assumed I would go on paying for convenience would meet a new truth. Back at the old house, I moved through rooms like a ghost with excellent posture, clearing the final traces that could be used to summon me back against my will, rolling the last of my clothes tightly and tucking them into the suitcase, wiping the shelves so clean that even dust would have to ask for a forwarding address, and leaving in the pantry exactly what I had decided days earlier. The single unopened box of my father's favorite coffee pods with the inventory list taped inside the lid like a ledger written by a calm accountant who has stopped apologizing for arithmetic, because there is a particular satisfaction in making the math visible when the story has tried so hard to deny it. I canceled the Wi-Fi plan that I had opened in my name back when the family insisted we should split costs and then never actually split anything, and I printed the cancellation confirmation because paper, though unfashionable, makes a satisfying sound when it lands on a kitchen counter, after which I walked through the small lit rectangles of every device that still remembered my passwords and signed them out with a patience that felt like a sacrament, watching the profiles disappear one by one until the glow looked like a landscape without roads. Because I told myself that every episode deserved its own clean act of revenge, something clever enough to register but not cruel enough to poison me. I opened the envelope that had arrived at my mailbox from the women's shelter across town where I had volunteered a few nights in the hardest winter, and I completed the recurring donation in my parents' names with the public acknowledgement box checked. Not as a joke, but as a correction, because if they wanted their surname printed in programs that conferred status, then let it be printed under a heading that suggested they believed in daughters, and I arranged for the quarterly newsletter to be mailed to their address so that the mailbox would become, however briefly, a teacher that did not raise its voice. I packed the decoy calendar into an old tote and left it hanging on the back of my closet door where any casual snoop would mistake it for the outline of a dull month, and I took one last slow lap through the house to confirm that the few remaining items I could not carry, a battered bookcase, a lamp with a sentimental dent, were tagged for the stoop sale with my note about scholarships and receipts, because good exits do not just close doors, they leave the lights on for anyone who wants to read. When the evening finally steadied into that heavy blue that makes everything look honest, I stood in the small bathroom where for years I learned to hide my composure under cheap mascara, peeled a strip of the blue painter's tape and set it straight as a surgeon's stitch along the bottom edge of the mirror, and with the black marker I wrote the message I had rehearsed until my hand knew the curve of each letter, for words that were neither theatrical nor shy and that delivered exactly what they meant without flinching: enjoy your paradise alone, after which I capped the pen, placed the tape beside the faucet like a polite toolkit for people who have work to do, and set my 2 keys on the counter so their small metallic clink would land in the silence, like the sound that begins the rest of a song. I left through the back door because the back door is where the unpraised leave when they do not wish to be seen, pulled it shut with a firm, ordinary motion that felt better than any speech, and walked down the alley toward the street where my car waited with its trunk already open, and as I slid behind the wheel I felt the phone vibrate with a number I did not recognize that somehow still belonged to my mother, and I let it ring into nothing, because tomorrow they would return to a house that could finally hear itself think, and I would wake in a studio with trees outside the window and a life that had room for a future, while somewhere inside those 4 words on a mirror the next consequence was already sharpening its teeth. They landed on a Sunday evening according to the itinerary that my mother had texted to the group chat as if logistics were affection, and while the plane taxied and the wheels cooled and the cabin lights woke up the sleepy vanity on every face, I was already sitting on the floor of my studio with my back against the bed frame, listening to the radiator click itself into usefulness and watching the street lamp draw a pale ladder on the wall, because sometimes the last act of a long story has to unfold without witnesses, and sometimes the only way to hear the truth arrive is to let silence introduce it. Which is exactly what I did as the first missed call from home rolled across the screen, and then another followed with the slightly frantic tempo of people who are only just realizing that the background character they kept off stage has left the building with the script. By the time they unlocked the front door, my mother's habitual gasp at the clean counters, my father's quick scan for signs of chaos, my brother's automatic pivot toward the fridge as if triumph requires appetizers, the house had already performed its part. The Wi-Fi was gone without ceremony. The streaming account greeted their evening with an access denied that felt dignified rather than spiteful. The utilities calendar had slid into its brief nap exactly as scheduled. The pantry offered a single pristine box of coffee pods with the inventory list tucked inside like a civics lesson, and on the bathroom mirror the 4 words I had promised to myself had settled into the glass with the authoritative calm of a notarized sentence, so that even if they wanted to argue they would have to do it in the face of handwriting that did not shake. What none of them expected, because you cannot expect what you have not bothered to imagine, was the arrival of the male slots chorus, the scholarship receipt with their names lettered in sincere gratitude, the first thin newsletter from the shelter with a photograph of girls in lab coats under a caption thanking the Bennett family for believing in futures, and a politely worded letter from the credit union that announced the closure of an account they had always referred to as our safety net, although the netting had been woven with my deposits. All of it arranged on the welcome mat by a postal worker whose professionalism accidentally curated an exhibit titled Consequences. I would love to say I did not care, yet care is stubborn and does not disappear on command, so when my cousin Leah called from her car and whispered with the bright, guilty energy of someone who has been waiting years for the scales to tilt, I pressed the phone to my ear and let her narrate the scene like a radio play, hearing my mother's voice move through disbelief toward indignation and finally into that ragged territory where fear wears the mask of anger, while my father tried to solve the optics, and my brother, who has never met a mirror that didn't flatter him, first made a joke and then launched into an analysis of how my timing was unfair because his launch, whatever that means when nothing has lifted off, required family unity. A phrase so ironic it nearly choked me even at a distance. Leah told me the neighbors were noticing the stoop sale signs and the scholarship flyer and the absence of my car, and she added in a tone I could picture clearly that the family group chat had been rebooted under a new name without me, which was both predictable and, in a way I refused to feel embarrassed about, briefly painful, because exclusion is never elegant even when chosen. My phone kept filling with attempts at negotiation that called themselves apologies, the kind where distance collapses only long enough to make demands. So I did the only merciful thing left and sent a single message to the old shared address that would bounce back to them from the locked inbox like a public notice posted on the courthouse door, a plain paragraph explaining that I was safe, employed on my own terms, housed in a place I paid for myself, and unwilling to re-enter conversations that used the word family as a chore list with a postscript that outlined the condition for any future talk, namely that they schedule 3 sessions with a mediator unaffiliated with our church or our neighborhood, and arrive with a written statement from each of them that begins not with excuses for favoritism, but with one sentence naming a moment they could have chosen me and didn't, after which they could send proof of attendance to the shelter's donation email, which would forward it to me, without handing them my address, a small logistical twist that made me laugh, because sometimes bureaucracy is a better bodyguard than anger. As for revenge, because I promised myself that every chapter would end with something nimble enough to be remembered without staining my hands, I submitted the final edit to a notice in the local paper's community column that thanked my parents by name for funding a new set of lab goggles and Bunsen burners for the high school science wing. A thank you drafted by the teacher who had once pressed my shoulder and said that sometimes girls need a bench that fits their hands, and I arranged with Leah to deliver the key to the storage locker where I had placed our family photographs wrapped in bubble and numbered in chronological order, a key she would hand to my mother only if my mother managed to tell her, without detours, into James's achievements. One story in which I showed up for the family and was not treated like a utility. Whether my mother would earn that key I did not know, and not knowing felt less cruel than pretending I did. I wish I could offer a tidy ending where everyone learns the lesson and the credits rise over a brunch table, yet what I have instead is a studio filled with the sound of steady heat, a row of trees that do not ask me to use the right tone, a phone that stays quiet unless I invite it to speak, and a name that fits inside my mouth without the aftertaste of being compared. Perhaps one day I will open my door to the kind of knock that signals humility, or perhaps the next newsletter will arrive with my family's names removed because they declined to meet the minimum requirement of honesty, and perhaps I will feel a sting when I imagine holidays arriving like trains I no longer board. Though perhaps that sting will remind me that I am alive and that living without permission is a discipline that improves with use. Tonight, as the lamp I bought with my own money warms the room and the window holds the last sliver of a sky that has stopped trying to be dramatic, I hold the silence like a bowl and let the unanswered questions breathe, whether they will come, whether I will open, whether love can survive an audit, whether the girl who disappeared from her parents' lives vanished to punish or to begin, and whether these are in fact the same act seen from two sides of a mirror that now reads, in 4 calm words, a promise I intend to keep.